Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Catherine. It's my pleasure to be here today. I was asked to talk about RTOs with specific emphasis on PJM and MISO. So that's my goal today. So we will focus on defining the footprints of the RTOs for those two regions, as well as throughout the United States. And understand, now I know why you were looking this way a little bit, Johnny, because it's a little bit smaller font than I thought. Understand similarities and differences between them. And essentially, they do the same thing, with different nuances, with different acronyms. Our very favorite thing in this industry is create new acronyms. So we have job security. So you'll hear about that. Also, to apply the concepts to understand potential policy differences and policy positions from different sectors within each of the RTOs. Lastly, we'll talk about operational and market structures of both of them, and then just understand a little bit about the challenges going on in the interconnection queues for both RTOs. And I've got some data to share, mostly so you can share with your neighbors, your colleagues, but also look back later and see where things stand for both of these companies. So is it okay if I just move out a little bit? Maybe I can see better and just move around a little bit if I'm not blocking the view from y'all. But then I'm not online, right? Do you want me to stand here? Sorry about that. Okay, so RTO stands for Regional Transmission Organization. They are nonprofit, they are public benefit entities that coordinate, control, and monitor the grid. You've heard about this before. They do not own assets, just like RF and all of the other EROs. Because interstate power flow is included across the commerce, then FERC governs the tariffs that the RTOs live by, not the state commissions. The roots of the fundamental organizational structure for RTOs come from a few specific FERC orders. I mentioned FERC Order 888 and 889 that established this interstate commerce and non-discriminatory transmission access. That really became the basis for independent system operators, which are single state. And we'll talk about examples in just a minute, but I just want to mention we're focusing on RTOs, which encourage multi-state operations and have additional functions, including transmission administration, transmission congestion, other functions that kind of built upon ISOs. And again, PJM and MISO are within this RF footprint, so we'll talk about them specifically. Membership is voluntary, and the mission remains to have economic efficiency, reliability, and non-discriminatory access to the transmission system. ISOs and RTOs serve 2/3 of the electricity in the United States, with independent areas covering the additional 1/3. Here's a map, which I believe you may have seen already this week, or today, excuse me, of the RTOs in the United States. And it's a little hard to read on the screen, but you can see it better on your computer, probably. But we'll talk about these a little bit more. You can see PJM and MISO. PJM is yellow, MISO is orange. RF covers both of those sections, both sections, excuse me, of MISO and I believe all of PJM. Is that correct? You RF people, I'm looking at you, almost all. Okay, but okay, so parts of Dominion and Eastern Kentucky are not in PJM. Got it. I learned something new. Oh, thank you, not in RF. Thank you very much. So in the flip side, MISO is split between RF, CERC, and MRO. So in terms of the footprints, I've just listed all of the RTOs and ISOs. 6 fall under FERC jurisdiction. ERCOT does not, because Texas does not generally have interstate commerce. So we talked a little bit already about RF as being one of the 6 EROs and includes both PJM and MISO. So what RTOs do every day, we've talked quite a bit about this already today, run the markets, including day ahead and real-time products, and they dispatch economically based on the lowest cost resources being dispatched first to maintain the system reliabilities, keep the lights on. They do planning for the grid, and they do it in 2 different ways. So I'm going to talk about that in a subsequent slide. The goal is regional transmission planning and also resource adequacy, to support resource adequacy. The coordination at the seams between MISO and PJM is very important, and MISO and PJM have seams with other entities as well, other RTOs, ISOs, and independent utilities. So let's get down to the nitty gritty just a little bit. So MISO serves about 121 gigawatts of load peak last year, and PJM serves 161 gigawatts. They are the two biggest RTOs in the country. You saw the map. MISO kind of runs north to south from part of Canada all the way down to Louisiana. And PJM is more geographically focused in a smaller area. So their load is more concentrated as well. MISO serves 45 million people, where PJM serves about 67 million people. And MISO is comprised of mostly traditionally regulated states and mostly traditionally regulated utilities, where PJM has a lot more mix of retail choice and vertically integrated utilities as well. In MISO, there's an annual capacity auction in which people can self-supply or participate in the auction. In MISO, only about 5% of the load is exposed to that capacity auction. I bring that up because most people don't know that. And when MISO's prices go all over the place, they all get wound up, and we're like, it doesn't matter for 95% of the load. So just keep that in mind. PJM is kind of the opposite, not exactly the same numbers, but in PJM, most of the load is included in the auction, which is a 3-year cycle. There is a self-supply option, which I know AEP typically does, and I'm not sure if there are other utilities that do as well. I will say I did work at MISO. I've been a stakeholder in both RTOs. So I'm stronger with MISO than I am PJM. So Courtney's going to answer all the difficult PJM questions. Both operate within RF, as we've mentioned, and have a joint and common market. They also do joint planning together. Thank you. There we go. And we've talked a little bit about NERC registration roles today, and I wanted to just highlight a few of the most popular ones and how MISO and PJM are different in terms of how they deal with NERC compliance. So the Reliability Coordinator, RC, Balancing Authority, BA, and TOP, Transmission Operator, are kind of core to the RTO functions. And of course, they require certification, as you well know. But in terms of MISO versus PJM manages all three of those roles, but MISO shares the BA responsibilities with the transmission operators. They call them local BAs, which you will not see the term LBA in a NERC glossary, but MISO has defined this with their transmission owners and their member agreement, and they have a coordinated functional registry, I'm saying that right, CFRs, between their transmission operators and MISO. So they share some of the requirements for NERC standards. Also, MISO does not operate breakers. PJM can and does, but MISO doesn't. MISO relies on their transmission owners to be the TOP. So the other roles are fairly straightforward. TOs, are in both entities. Transmission planning occurs at both the local utility level as well as at the RTO level. The planning coordinator is PJM and MISO. Generator owners and generator operators exist obviously within both of those markets. In the case of PJM, there are a lot more independent power producers who serve in the roles of GO and GOP than there are in MISO. Both have a mix, but just they're slanted one way versus the other. Are there any questions about this? I did want to mention from a load forecasting standpoint, PJM has been doing its own load forecasting for years, and MISO has relied on their transmission owners and load serving entities to provide the utilities to provide the load forecast. So I like to think of it as kind of a top down versus bottom up approach. Recently, MISO also started doing its own load forecasting, so they kind of have two sets of data. And part of that was for transmission planning, longer term transmission planning purposes. So they had a common set of data from which to plan for futures, to plan their future scenarios for transmission planning. But it's just a nuance that's slightly different between the two RTOs. Okay, in terms of state jurisdiction, the states still approve the resource mix for their specific state. The PUCs are responsible for resource adequacy. As you well know, if you read any of the news or articles in the industry press, there's a lot of tension right now between resource adequacy and the states and both of these RTOs, and how can we meet the needs of our growing demand as well as manage retirements and other changes going on. The states do still regulate retail service, but we know that there are wholesale market components and inputs into the retail rates that sometimes can be 75 to 80% of the total amount of money that's included in rates. But there's just a kind of a delineation between the two. In most cases, the states are in charge of transmission siting, or they may have local or regional entities that do transmission siting. That is not the RTO. The RTO has to provide open access and be very transparent about how to gain access. In terms of cost allocation for transmission purposes, MISO and PJM do things slightly differently. MISO has had pretty robust cost allocation discussions and engagement from stakeholders for years. And they have a group that's called RECB, just to have one acronym. I'm going to forget what it stands for. That's terrible. I should stop doing this. But it's basically regional cost allocation and cost and benefit allocation for transmission costs from 100 kV and up. PJM has a higher threshold for cost allocation. It's 500 kV and above. Since FERC issued Order 1920 a couple of years ago, they've dictated that states be consulted for cost allocation discussions. So PJM has set up a separate group where the states are engaged in these conversations. For a while, it was monthly. I'm not sure if it still is or not as often, according to Benjamin. That's probably good. They made some progress and laid some foundational things in place. But that's just one other element of kind of jurisdictional boundaries. So I want to talk just slightly for a few minutes about how stakeholder processes work. Both RTOs are very dependent upon stakeholder processes, just like NERC and the standards development teams that Diane mentioned this morning. An issue is raised by either a stakeholder, a board member, staff person, a government official that needs to be discussed and resolved. And so there's usually some kind of steering committee that it reviews the issue and determines which committee within the stakeholder structure needs to take that as a primary issue. Every once in a while, there'll be like a special group that's pulled together. If it's a markets and a reliability issue, that needs to be worked on together. But they usually propose specific options for how to resolve the issue. And each RTO has slightly different processes. PJM's is very transparent, and they use Excel spreadsheets to list the issue, the options, the benefits, who said what. And I mean, these spreadsheets go on for like 3 monitors across if you're trying to look at them. MISO tends to have PowerPoint slides that explain everything that are not really easy to read sometimes, because if you miss the meeting, you don't really get the transition between what the slides are saying and what the person verbally said. So I'm just giving you some of the nuances just based on my experience. I see some smiles, so I think some of you have experienced some of that as well. But they try to be as transparent as they can to lay things out. Some issues are voted on by stakeholders. PJM uses stakeholder voting a lot more than MISO does. MISO pretty much limits it to the planning committee, and that's just based on the charter for each of their committees. And MISO considers the stakeholder votes advisory. And so the board decides basically what to file with FERC. PJM is different. PJM takes what the stakeholders vote on, and that's what they have to do, just based on their agreements. Like I said, the board can make a decision to move forward, and then the FERC filing is made. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. PJM did create what they call CIF, I don't know how you pronounce this acronym, CIFP, CIFP, there you go, thank you. Critical issue fast path, and so it's a very structured process. Other RTOs don't have a structured process named like that, but they do have ways to expedite filings. So I want to talk a little bit about the planning models and how planning is accomplished in 2 different ways. Generally, integrated resource planning is a process whereby a utility looks at 15 to 20 years into the future and says, what will our load forecast look like, and how do we think we'll meet that need? Vertically integrated utilities typically do this, and they usually own generation, and they're regulated monopolies, we know that. An IRP maps out a long-term least cost supply based on a lot of factors. Usually there's several different futures that are developed. As if the world looks like this, if the world, like 3 or 4, maybe 5 different scenarios into the future. And then the state commissions review these plans, and some approve them, some just provide comments on them. We were talking about this at lunch a little bit. The utility bears the build or buy decision, and then they go back to their commission to propose a specific solution. So the IRP is not a Bible, it's not a playbook, it's a general sense of what the world might look like into the future. And it's very common in MISO. There are PJM and utilities that also do integrated resource planning. It's typically legislated. And in some states, co-ops and munis are exempt from IRP work. In Indiana, they're not. The association that is a municipal association, they do it for all the municipals who are our members. And then there are 2 generation transmission cooperatives in Indiana, and each of them do their own IRP. If we go on to the deregulated side, generally, again, general statements, the resource planning is more market-based. So generation is competitive and unbundled from the wires business. The developers or independent power producers sell energy and capacity into the RTO markets. Resource additions are based on those market signals rather than being utility planned. And this has been a little lumpy lately and challenging, especially in market-based additions, as we well know. Capacity and energy prices, not an IRP, signal where and when to build. And like I said, this is very common in PJM. I'm going to pause and see if either anybody has questions or comments based on their experiences with this modeling or this planning and modeling approach. I see a smile from Benjamin.
I used to research this in academia, so we did a research project in government. So this is one of the clearest slide decks I've ever seen playing this out. Well, thank you. And also having worked at the Ohio Commission and worked with people on different sides of this slide, this is incredibly clear. So first and foremost, thank you. And also, I think that people get sort of entrenched in whichever side of the slide you're on, and you end up believing that's correct. And it's your lived experience. It doesn't mean it's right. And so if you live on a scene or you live in a state where they have both, so Indiana or Michigan, you could be all over this.
Thank you. I'm going to paraphrase just a little bit, if you don't mind, Benjamin, for people online. So thank you for your compliment that this is clearly laid out, that some people think there might be right or wrong ways to do this. Depends on what your experience is and what your foundation is, but they're both part of the world we live in. Is that a fair assessment? They both have their limitations and their merits. You're correct. Correct. Thank you. Yes.
Legislators delegated state their jurisdiction is as you all to maybe sink your teeth into this work.
Thank you. So Will with MRO suggested we talk a little bit about the roles of OPSI and OMS. First, I'll explain the acronyms. So OPSI stands for Organization of PJM States, Inc., right? Incorporated. And that's comprised of the regulators that are within the PJM footprint. And OMS is similar, Organization of MISO States. So they're different. They serve different roles from what I understand. So some states have representatives in both organizations because like Kentucky, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana have, not Michigan, excuse me, just the other 3, Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, have part of their load is in PJM and parts in MISO, but they are recognized entities that the RTOs work with, and they have representatives that work with, meet with the executives of each and the staff of each of those RTOs to try to identify issues, resolve them, understand their positions. In the case of MISO, OMS is a very strong force and has a lot of influence in the discussions, but also at FERC. They do quite a few filings with when MISO files something either in support of or not in support of something. But if they can't reach agreement, then I call it the least common denominator. They acknowledge what's going on. And then sometimes certain factions will file like a subgroup of OMS. But they do have a lot of dialogue and work toward reaching agreement. And OPSI has a similar role. I don't know that they're as structured, and correct me if I'm wrong with those of you that have more PJM experience, but OPSI has identified potential solutions and also not only filed with FERC, but they tend to write letters to the board at PJM and explain their position, especially lately. So it's just different techniques that they use. And having gone to a lot of different stakeholder meetings, let me see, MISO tends to be what we call Midwest nice, where people are super polite in the meetings and they go to the parking lot or they go to the bar afterward and then kind of complain. PJM is sort of the opposite. So, in my opinion, PJM, people stand up and just kind of let it all out there in front of the board members and everything. And then they go afterward and slap themselves on the back and, hey, let's just go relax and have a good time together. I mean, it's just really interesting because I don't know if it's the culture of the states or culture of the organization. I, again, see some smiles, so maybe y'all have had the similar experience. Do you want me to mention anything else, Will, or would you like to mention anything else about those two organizations?
Here's some advice that, someone to, yeah.
So Will suggesting that legislators and legislative staff get to know the OPSI or OMS representatives from their state. And they're typically commissioners. Sometimes they're staff people, or staff people are like a substitute if the commissioner can't make the meetings or has to stand in for some reason. So that's a good point to bring up. Thank you very much. We've been talking a bit about resource adequacy challenges. So last summer, FERC convened a technical conference for all of the RTOs to come and talk about how they're going to meet the resource adequacy challenges. And it was actually very well done. I don't know if any of you attended this last June, but it's worth going back and listening to some of the video that was recorded of representatives from all the RTOs, and they had legitimate conversations with the FERC commissioners and quite a few people from outside, within industry, but outside of either entity that attended. So FERC got the flag, we need to do something. They're waving the flag, I guess I should say. For 2026 and 2027, both MISO and PJM identified potential areas where there could be a loss of load. And I did want to mention one thing while we're here. You'll see that designation 26, 27 or subsequent years. It stands for what's called a planning year in MISO and a delivery year in PJM. Two different acronyms, they are exactly the same thing. So PY for planning year, it starts June 1st of this year and goes through May of the following year. Same cycle, at least for PJM, they just call it DY for delivery year, in case you see reports that look like that. So there have been a lot of activities going on this year to look for future solutions, including FERC holding a PJM governance reform conference just a few weeks ago and really demanding governance reforms for PJM by next month, very short time frame, and to either figure things out to avoid having stalemates with your stakeholder voting processes, or if you won't figure it out, we'll figure it out for you. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what I read through the lines from the FERC statements. In the meantime, FERC also ordered NERC to finish working on the reliability standards that have been in progress for several years for the large load, through the large load working group by December of this year. Very, very expedited process. As we talked about earlier, the standards development process is pretty intense. So I'll talk a little bit about the queue status for both MISO and PJM. Both have been challenged with a lot of applications and delays in terms of the study cycles. For one thing, both RTOs have had more generation in their queue than their current load. So if you remember what Johnny said about balancing load and generation, it's kind of hard to balance the two when the generation's bigger than the load itself. And also traditionally, only a third of the applications that are submitted in the queues are actually built. So knowing which third those are going to be, they can't. They have to look at every single application fairly and just go through the process. So MISO and PJM, like I said, have tried to do reforms, and PJM over the last several years has been quicker than MISO, but they still are trying to make it even more efficient than it was. So MISO would do first in, first out in terms of the applications and the project analysis, and then recently started doing some cluster studies and increasing the deposit that was required for each phase along the way, and having less ability to get your money back. So people that were really serious about building would apply. They also proposed last year the expedited resource addition study, which I believe was mentioned earlier today too, ERIS, which was delivered to the stakeholders during the Taylor Swift Eras tours, which was actually pretty hilarious. People say, how do you pronounce that? Just think Taylor Swift and you're all set. So it basically runs alongside the existing process to meet the most urgent needs. And we'll talk about a little bit more in a subsequent slide. There are lots of ways to track the activity. We'll give some examples in a moment, but there's an activity interactive map on MISO's website, and you can also download a spreadsheet. I usually just date stamp it when I download it so I know what date it was, and you can manipulate it yourself to sort the data. And then there's a generation interconnection queue site with a subsite within the MISO website. Like I said, mentioned, historically, PJM has been smoother and a little faster than the MISO process. But usually the new generation timelines are still 3 to 5 years, where in MISO it was like 5 to 8 years. They did create the Reliability Resource Initiative, which I believe Michelle mentioned this morning, with final agreements expected later this year. They also have ways to track what's going on in their queue. You can export their request status page similar to the MISO spreadsheet. They're just called different things. PJM tends to provide interconnection media updates occasionally. I don't know that there's a specific cycle, but there was one that was published in May. And then there's the link for their website that's active for their queue activity. Let's talk a minute about MISO's ERIS program. It was a temporary process, is a temporary process with quarterly submissions, and was approved last year, and it sunsets next summer. So it's very short term to try to get these resources online. They did have more strict eligibility than traditional requirements. So the developer or utility had to have 100% site control. And the RERA, the state regulator, had to be notified and also provide a letter of support saying, we think this resource is a good idea. We think it's necessary. In some cases, purchase power agreements were signed. In other cases, they were for the utility for their own load. They had to have off-take agreements in hand. So like I said, PPAs or a utility agreement. And then the deposit was non-refundable. So, but this queue filled up like that and within hours, from what I understand, and they're plugging through to get these things approved, and it's a quarterly cycle for the analysis. It seems to be going well, from what I understand. MISO provided this status report in June, and it may be a little tricky to read on the screen here, but the legend shows color-coded resources. So yellow is solar, you see that. On the left is what's called weighting projects. They use the term CP nodes, which is critical pricing node. Basically, it's a market-based node, and there could be more than one project at a node, but that's the way that they depicted this specific data. But the weighting projects are anything that's waiting to be interconnected, and the delayed projects are a subset of those, whereby the owner has communicated we are not going to meet our initial commercial operations date. So it's just kind of two different ways to look at what's in the queue. The delays are common between PJM and MISO, having to do with siting, permitting, equipment, supply chain. I was intrigued a couple of years ago when the turbine manufacturers started their own queues with deposits and positions, and utilities would even purchase a spot in the turbine queue, and then they could negotiate with their fellow utilities if they weren't going to be able to build, somebody else could. I mean, it's all, I guess, money and time, right? This is another way to look at the commercial operations forecast. So I know you can't read that from far across the room, but we're in 2026 on the far left-hand side. And in 2028, MISO expects 34 gigawatts of new generation to enter the queue, to enter the grid. They update this fairly often. Typically, MISO does reports on a quarterly basis that align with their board meetings. So their board meets in with the public. They meet more often, but with the public in March, June, September, and December. So I normally keep my eye out for the updates before their board meetings. PJM actually has an annual meeting in May, and they always have a lot of good updates before their board. They have other meetings again with the board, but that's just a big meeting. That's really a good time to be in tune with what's going on. I wanted to show you a couple more views again for you to be able to look at later of the delay information that's been communicated to MISO. So they listed it here, longest delay to shortest delay by region and also by state. So MISO has three regions, the north, the central, and the south. And a lot of times north and central work closely together. I mean, the data's together because they have a lot of electrical interconnections, where the south was added to MISO somewhat later than the original MISO footprint and has much less interconnection capability between the two. So this is one way to look at it. And then there's also a state comparison, which is pretty interesting if you want to look at your own state's status, average days of delay, which is nobody's fault. It's not like, oh, the commission's done something wrong if that state has a long delay time. It has nothing to do with that. It just has to do with the circumstances of the projects and whatever is delaying them. So it shows it by resource type, same legend, and also by state. I thought it was pretty interesting to be able to, I downloaded that Q spreadsheet and then mapped this by each state, which it's a really cool tool, by the way. If you haven't seen it yet in Excel, when you go under insert chart, you do it by geography and it creates this map for the United States. I haven't tried international, be something to find out, but this is based on the number of projects. This is the total queue. Let's talk a minute about PJM's fast track process, which is the Reliability Resource Initiative. They initiated this with the agreements in place by the end of this year. And there were 51 projects that were accepted, about 9.4 gigawatts. And the plan is for all of this to be built by 2030. It's a pretty aggressive schedule. These numbers do represent what PJM calls UCAP, unforced capacity, after accounting for outages, similar to what Johnny was talking about with installed capacity. UCAP is a slight variation based on the specific RTOs formula. Typically, PJM focuses on the UCAP capabilities in the winter because that's when their supply is most critical. MISO actually created UCAP values for all 4 seasons of the year. And they also have planning reserve margin requirements for all 4 seasons of the year. So it's a more complicated planning process with the MISO data sets than it is for PJM at this point. So here's a picture of the queue status within PJM. They use different colors. I like the fact that the slides you guys presented this morning had the same color codes for both MISO and PJM. But so solar is red in this case instead of yellow, but they show 53 gigawatts in the queue now. This is everything, not just that 9.4 gigawatts from the RRI. And again, I just downloaded this to have a similar slide between MISO and PJM with the number of projects. And PJM specifically talks about status options for this set of data, that they're active in engineering, procurement, under construction, and it's about a third of the total amount in the queue, which is consistent with what's been seen historically in both RTOs. Yes. Was the question, why is there a dark color in Virginia? It's because of the data center growth. Yes. It's pretty intense, the number of resources that are being planned there. So PJM introduced the reliability backstop procurement bilateral RFP, request for proposal, not something that rolls off your tongue, but that was just this spring. And they published it in June and responses were due in July. They asked for load and generation resources to submit their requirements and also their capabilities, and going through the process to marry up potential parties to have short-term agreements and then also longer-term agreements in terms of bilateral agreements. So PJM's in the process of kind of marrying things together. And then there's some negotiations, of course, that are happening as well. And the initial results are expected in December of 2026. Let's talk for a minute about large loads. I know we've mentioned it several times today. So FERC issued a docket in June of this year using its Section 206 rights, which basically says to the FERC jurisdictional entity, prove to us that you can do this or prove to us that this is correct. So they issued it to all 6 of the RTOs within their jurisdiction, giving them 60 days to respond, to justify or reform their large load tariffs. And each one is slightly different. And in each RTO, there are a lot of stakeholder conversations going on, and the filings are due today, essentially. So I imagine was that delayed, Benjamin?
For a delay until November 18th, which is, and all the RTOs signed it together, the delay request, because that's like a couple days after the utility regulatory conference in November. That's pending right now, but all of the jurisdictional RTOs signed on that request.
Thank you. So I understand that all 6 RTOs asked FERC for an extension till November 18th, and FERC has not responded yet. I wonder if they will today, since today's the 18th, who knows? But that they set a threshold of 20 megawatts for the large load definition, which is pretty much what stakeholders have been rallying around, including the NERC Large Load Working Group, which is the next point. They're discussing reliability issues and proposing requirements. So those of you who went on the First Energy tour yesterday, the Advanced Technology Center, saw several relays. I called them blue boxes. What NERC is recommending is that the utilities that are serving large loads, as well as the large load sites, install special relaying equipment. They're called phaser measurement units, or PMUs, and phaser data collectors, PDCs, to actually look at sub-cycle information for frequency and voltage variations. You can predict where there might be a problem in many cases, especially if you have a whole network of these kinds of devices. And you can also use them for event analysis after the fact to see what happened and prevent issues in the future. So if you've seen that, you've seen a relay box, that's what PDH and PMU and PDH look like. MISO and PJM specific stakeholder groups are working in parallel with the NERC developments to try to improve situational awareness, and they are aligned with these kinds of requirements for more equipment. So you can follow developments with RF, and there will be an update, I believe, next month at the meeting in Columbus. At least it's on the agenda. And there's also a link here to the NERC Large Load Working Group site. I wanted to introduce a couple of data sets. I think you saw a map from this site earlier today, maybe weren't aware of it, but it's called Grid Status IO. And I want to thank Brian for introducing me to this because I had not seen it before. It's a free service that you can go and look up information about transmission and generation resources and projects all across the country. It includes the RTOs and also the areas that are not served by RTOs where there are independent utilities. It's very robust. You can also subscribe if you want to be able to download a lot more information. I think right now with a free subscription, I can get 5 exports per month, and you can click on what data you want. So it can click on a specific RTO or the whole country, and also what entities you want to see. So if you want to look at only generation resources or only transmission resources, again, they're scraping data from several different websites and making it easy to use. I found it fascinating. You can also drill down into a specific region, your state, your region, and see specific projects. I have a couple more examples. So there's pricing information and also specific power plants that show up, and you can drill down a little bit more and see what the project name is or what the plant name is, when it was in service or when it will be in service, what the capabilities are. It's just really interesting to me, including a polygon of where it's located. So you can impress your friends and your colleagues and say, check out this website, or just use it in your PowerPoint presentations and go from there. It's just called Grid Status, all one word, .io. And there's a link on that page, and there's a link in the appendix too. I want to talk a minute about transmission planning. I mentioned FERC Order 1920 that requires long-term planning, including cost allocation to have state input into that process. But some of the RTOs we're doing 1 to 5 year transmission planning, and some were doing 15 to 20-year planning. So this standardizes the planning requirements going into the future. And also there's specific factors and benefits that need to be reported to FERC on a regular basis. The idea is also to incorporate alternative technologies like the GETs we talked about in the last presentation. Any questions about that or comments? Okay. In terms of wrapping things up, just want to remind you that RTOs and ISOs cover about 2/3 of the electricity needs in the United States, and including MISO and PJM. Resource adequacy continues to be the most significant challenge that we're facing in the industry right now, with demand growth outpacing new supply. And remember that the fast tracks are in place, and you can track those, all the acronyms, RRI and ARIS, to try to prioritize adding capacity more quickly. Keep an eye out for reform with the transmission planning, as well as the NERC standards for the large loads. And then interconnection queues and large load tariffs will definitely still be something active to follow this year as well as into the future. I'm going to mention a couple more things. If you want to keep abreast of what's going on in MISO and PJM, they have really good tools. You just have to navigate them a little bit. So in both cases, you can create an account on their website that's free. With PJM, sometimes you have to coordinate with an administrator within your organization, which if you know someone else who's accessing the sites, they can help you with that. But you can set up alerts based on your specific email address and your interest. And there's also specific mailing lists. MISO has a choice also that you can synchronize their calendar with your calendar. So if you say, I want to go to all of the reliability subcommittee meetings, and you click that, if they move the meeting, you'll automatically get an updated appointment for it, which is pretty nice. MISO has what's called a help center with knowledge articles about specific topics. If you use Google MISO Help Center, it goes to it really quickly. Some of the search capabilities within the MISO website aren't that great, but they're better to use Google or my Copilot or something to find out where you want to go. But also you can follow what's called BPMs in MISO business practice manuals. Those are how the tariff is administered, basically. PJM has something similar called manuals, but MISO's is called BPMs. So in terms of specific things to follow, the RASC stands for the Resource Adequacy Subcommittee. It's very active this year and previous years and going forward. They deal with the questions about planning reserve margins and calculations for the formula for UCAP and other requirements on a seasonal basis. The IPWG is the Interconnection Process Working Group. Again, a very active group. And then the advisory committee is comprised of stakeholders in all of the sectors across MISO, and they engage with the board on the quarterly basis at those quarterly board meetings. But it's kind of a good way to see overall what's going on in MISO and what's most important. Then you can drill down into specific topics or specific other subcommittees. And you can also follow items on what MISO calls a dashboard. So they have what are the hot topics, the issues they're following. Remember, we talked earlier about the stakeholder process. When an issue is raised, it's assigned an issue number, and then it's tracked within the MISO dashboard. It usually shows what committee is covering it, when the last update was, when the next update's supposed to be happening. Sometimes they happen, sometimes they don't. It just happens. And then related documents, PowerPoint slides, white papers, and there's also a place for stakeholder feedback. And MISO would issue requests for stakeholder feedback. PJM does too. They're just slightly different processes. And you can see a summary of the feedback that people have provided, and typically a response from MISO about the feedback as well. And some of it's nitty-gritty details, and some of it's very high-level policy. So it's just across the board. Within PJM, again, create an account on their website and set up alerts and committee updates, requests for that information. Their library is slightly different, but they have really awesome training materials. They complement each other. I mean, some of them are generic enough that you can read one RTO's training materials and apply it to both, and some are very specific. But for example, PJM has awesome NERC standards NERC standards training. It's a week-long program, and it's free for PJM members, and regulators are usually invited to go, legislators are invited to go, and maybe more than what you want, but also they have overviews and online training options that are very well done. You can review materials even if you can't attend the meetings. And the members committee is a very active one too. It's similar to the advisory committee where the stakeholders from across all the sectors are included. And then the markets and reliability committee is combined, where in MISO, those are two different groups. So it's just a different way that they govern their work. But those are always very active as well. And then they have what's called an issue tracking page, similar to the MISO dashboard. I do want to mention that their apps are also very good as well. I believe it was Brian that mentioned their apps. You can see real-time pricing in terms of location marginal prices for both of them. And also any alerts that you want to set up within the app can be different than what you set up on your email on their main page. And I'm trying to think there's something else. Oh, if there is an emergency event, they'll send event notifications through the apps, which I really like because you don't have to go digging in your email because it just comes on your screen. And you can activate them to be notified right away or not, depending if you're going on vacation, turn it off for the week. And when you come back, turn it back on. Any other questions? Are there questions or any other comments, I should say, from people's experiences? Brian, would you like the microphone?
We just had a couple people online just submitting a couple things. So I think on the one slide, we were talking about the data centers being registered at 20 megawatts. So this is very, very fluid. So the comments are now out raising that threshold to 50 megawatts and 100 kV. Now, this all has to be voted upon and go through the standards process, but it started off as at 20 megawatts with the 1 megawatt of computational load. So that's a very fluid thing. So we're going to be watching this. The other thing, when you were going through the registrations, you were talking about, PGM is not only an RTO, but they're also a transmission operator. So the one clarification that someone wanted to make was that they still do rely on their the utilities, First Energy, Duquesne, and AP to open and close the breakers. So they do give out operating instructions. They are ultimately responsible for the breakers opening and closing through their communications and EDART systems, but the SCADA tools to open and close are in those utility systems. Kind of like how MISO relies on, NIPSCO, Hoosier, ATC, and whatnot. So all the other comments I got from my friends on team said this is great and they enjoyed learning more about the RTO. So thank you so much for your time and your presentation today.
Thanks for the clarification, people online. Yes, question.
Do you see like the state queues as like a gate to the bigger queue? When you're talking about the bigger PJM queue, is that including the time it takes to go through the different processes at the state, local level?
Okay, the question is from Representative Rader, who's on the power siting board, correct, in Ohio, and he asked if the timelines are related to the state queues or if they're a precursor to the PJM queue. I am not familiar with that. So I'm not really sure how that works because I've not been exposed. Does someone else want to answer that question? I'll hand you the microphone.
Or briefly, yes, they are related, but it depends on the project. And Matt Butler on the power siting board can walk you through the details of that. But there is sort of a nested relationship there. But there are ones that are like state specific that are not going to show up there. So there is interactivity, and siting does vary on the requirements at the local level, which could be a driver. So your slide excellently put forth like, here's what the state is, and you're very correct to say that the state isn't themselves like fully responsible for this. There could be state processes that are a factor in that. So they may, if your state had a longer bar for delays, it could be because of that. So there is right now both for the sake of the RTOs, the ReliabilityFirst and MRO folks of the world, a desire to harmonize the siting and permitting processes. And that's actually one of the few bipartisan things that are happening in DC right now that would then flow through, hopefully to a state, hopefully to a power siting board equivalent entity in whatever state you're in. And there will be sort of continued conversations there. So I hope I didn't muddy it more.
Like a relationship state and status complicated, right?
Yeah. It's that the Canadian philosopher Avril Lavigne, why'd you have to go make things so complicated? Yeah, fair. Gotcha.
Thank you. I haven't seen state delay data for PJM. If it exists out there, I'm not exactly sure where. If someone else does, feel free to share it with the group. But I've only seen that within MISO. I'm curious if it might be a conversation with OPSI.
It's a big conversation to state, like all the queues are delaying these projects, the queue this, the queue that. Sometimes I think people get confused between the state processes, the jam processes, and I think we're speeding up now. It seems like things are starting to get a little bit better, but yeah, it's just kind of confusing in my mind as to like where the buck stops talking about queues. I think we're trying to straighten that out, stop clocks and AP15, straightening out like our broadly, but.
The comment is sometimes it's confusing when people talk about queues. Is it a state queue or PJM queue? Here's another comment. Would you like, I should move this microphone around more often. This discussion's great. I'm enjoying it.
And another fine thing in your slides that I'd compliment too is sort of those sprints of queue clearing that are happening, eras and the RRI and PJM, and these are intended to be stopgap measures for a limited time. Essentially the existing processes for clearing the queue were not meeting the immediate needs of, particularly of data centers that were like, hey, we're coming on in 3 years. Like, we're not a study us for a decade thing. We are coming on, and the existing processes within given RTOs weren't fast enough. So they wanted to create this stopgap, and then their idea is to have more long-term fixes. So they start deploying AI and other things to clear queues much more quickly, but they weren't going to get to that in time for what's already like emerging. So that's why you have these innovations, but those are especially, those have a time limit. So ARIS is only supposed to be a 3-year process. That's it. This is going to exist. We talk about this now. It's 3 years. After 3 years, the RTO has to have their act together. And so they all had to apply to FERC and say, our queue clearing thing doesn't work yet. Here's our stopgap. Please approve this. And we commit to having this fixed by X date. And FERC's been very stern on that. Oh, that's helpful.
Thank you. I did want to mention that MISO also has a load expedited process, a load analysis and transmission project analysis process called an expedited project review, whereby the local utility in most cases proposes a solution in order to get a load connected and transmission upgrades occur. Sometimes they're paid for by the load, sometimes they're paid for by the utility or some mix, sometimes they're put into the MTEP, the MISO Transmission Expansion Plan, for cost allocation, just depending on where the benefits are. But those processes have been quite active. And we're seeing, at least in India, in my home county, some loads and transmission lines being built within a 3-year cycle, 3-year project schedule right now. And they're on time. I mean, right now they are. It's been really interesting. And crazy busy at these construction sites. For the data center building, in one case, a pharmaceutical manufacturer is building 2 facilities, plus the transmission lines, 50 miles of 138 kV. And they built 69,000 volt line for temporary power, which amazed me. I like fell out of my chair when I heard that. I mean, temporary is usually 120 volts, you know, maybe you'll have 12 kV temporary to a site. I'd never seen 69 kV for construction purposes. Does anyone else have anything they want to mention? We're ahead of time a little bit about data centers, challenges in their regions, potential solutions. And if you don't mind just saying where you're from, who you are, where you're from, that'd be great.
How come I'm the only one? Okay, Mark Roberg from North Star Clean Energy. I just had a question. So Michelle showed a slide this morning that talked about the risk of the grid not meeting the needs. You know, it had all that red and orange. And how does that work together with the same slide that shows here's all this generation or capacity that's waiting to come online, and it's all held up in various delays? It seems that they're kind of like really related. If you could get rid of some of the delays, you would reduce some of that risk. So any comment on that, please?
You're absolutely right that the risks and the opportunities are not aligned from a timing standpoint. I think they both, everyone's trying to get to the same end, which is serve the load in a timely manner. But and from what I've seen, a lot of it's just supply chain. They can't build turbines fast enough. They can't build the transmission towers fast enough and don't have enough construction people to do the work. I mean, in our county, I mentioned, there are 5,000 electricians being employed. We have 55,000 people who live in our county, and there are 5,000 electricians who are coming in every day to do work. It's just amazing. But Michelle, I'll let you answer as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's a really good question. And one of the things that I was going to mention is that with the map that I put up earlier this morning, those ERAs and RRI projects were not included because they didn't meet the cutoff deadline of the data submittal. We will be including them in our next revision of the LTRA. And what we do though, even when that data is submitted, we look at those projects, we look at also how far along are they as well. So we have 3 tiers that we place them into buckets, and Johnny probably can go into a lot more detail with this, but we have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Those in tier 3 are the least further along. So we need to kind of take a look at when that data does come in, how far along are they really? Do they have interconnection agreements yet? Are they under construction? And we saw, slides that Joan had provided that particularly in MISO, she had that slide with the delays. So that's something for us to kind of take a look at how many are delayed as well. Yep. Johnny, did you want to add anything?
No, you did perfect.
Okay.
Are there any other questions or comments based on your experiences? We all come from such different backgrounds and parts of the industry. That's fascinating to me. If not, well, thank you for your time.